2 days ago, at 8:30 in the morning, while people in Oakland were pouring coffee and dropping their kids at school, the ground under their feet moved. A sharp, shallow earthquake tore along a fault that the United States Geological Survey calls the most dangerous urban fault in America. Not the San Andreas, not some fault you've never heard of, the Hayward fault. And it happened in the same week that scientists quietly confirmed something most people still don't know. The next major earthquake on that fault could shake the ground 50% harder than the models our buildings were designed for. 50%. Not a rounding error, not a minor adjustment. A number that changes what prepared actually means for 8 million people. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what happened this week, why scientists are more concerned than they've been in years, and what these numbers really mean for the tens of millions of people living on top of California's fault network right now. Let's start with the earthquake itself, because the timing here is not a coincidence, and it's not being overstated. On Thursday, August 13th, 2026, at 8:30 in the morning, a magnitude 3. 8 earthquake struck just north of San Leandro with an epicenter near the Oakland Zoo. The United States Geological Survey first measured it at 4. 1, then revised it down to 3. 8 as more data came in. The quake was shallow, just over 5 kilometers deep, which is exactly why it was felt so widely. Reports poured in on the USGS Did You Feel It? System from Santa Rosa in the north, down through San Francisco and the peninsula, all the way to Santa Cruz in the south, and east to Sacramento. Within an hour, aftershocks followed. A magnitude 3. Near the Oakland-San Leandro border just after 9 a.m., A2, 8 minutes later. People described it the way people always describe shallow strike-slip shaking. Not a single jolt, but a rolling, swaying motion, like the ground briefly turned to liquid beneath them. A dog jumped into its owner's lap at the Oakland Zoo. Bart briefly paused trains as a standard safety precaution. No injuries, no structural damage. Life went on. On its own, a 3.8 magnitude earthquake is nothing. It's a Tuesday in California. But where it happened is what makes this worth your attention. This shaking occurred directly on the Hayward Fault, and the Hayward Fault is not just another crack in the earth. It is a 74-mile-long fracture that runs like a spine through the most densely populated stretch of the East Bay, underneath or alongside Oakland, Berkeley, Hayward, Fremont, San Leandro, Richmond, El Cerrito, and San Pablo. Roughly 2.5 million people live directly on top of it. BART tunnels cross it. The University of California, Berkeley, sits on its trace. Its football stadium is literally built across the fault line. And the fault has not produced a major rupture since October 21st, 1868. A magnitude 6, 8 to 7. A zero earthquake that leveled downtown Hayward and killed about 30 people, back when the entire Bay Area held 250,000 residents instead of 8 million. That was 158 years ago. Here's why that number matters. Scientists dig trenches across fault lines and read the layers of disturbed soil the way you'd read tree rings. And that paleoseismic record shows the Hayward Fault's last 5 major ruptures happened roughly every 140 to 150 years apart, going back 7 centuries. Do the math from 1868, and you land almost exactly on today. The USGS calls this a fault that's not just due, it's overdue. Their official 30-year forecast, running from 2014 to 2043, gives the Hayward-Rogers Creek fault system a 33% chance of producing a magnitude 6, 7 or greater earthquake. That's the single highest probability assigned to any fault in the Bay Area, higher than the San Andreas itself, which sits at 22%. And for the region as a whole, accounting for every fault working together, the USGS puts the 30-year probability of a magnitude 6, 7+ earthquake somewhere in the Bay Area at 72%. Say that out loud. 72%. If you're 30 years old and living in the Bay Area right now, there is roughly a 3 in 4 chance a major earthquake hits this region before you turn 60. Before your kids are grown, before your mortgage is paid off, if the house is even still standing by then. Now here's the part of this story that changes everything, and it's the part almost nobody outside seismology circles has actually absorbed yet. In April of this year, scientists at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published a study in the journal Seismological Research Letters using exascale computing, the most powerful class of supercomputing that currently exists on Earth, to simulate 50 separate magnitude 7 earthquake scenarios on the Hayward Fault. What they found should be front page news, and it barely made a ripple, because of something called the rupture directivity effect, essentially the way seismic energy focuses forward like a beam of light when a fault tears. And because of how the geology of the East Bay hills and basins amplifies shaking, the researchers found that ground motion in a real Hayward earthquake could be up to 50% stronger than the models currently used to calibrate building codes and retrofit standards. Areas like Orinda and Moraga, sitting on fractured sedimentary rock in the hills, could see shaking 50% more intense than what firmer bedrock on the west side would experience. The Livermore Valley basin traps and stretches seismic waves, pushing shaking durations past 2 minutes in some scenarios and pushing modified Mercalli intensities to 7s or higher across roughly half of the urban zone near the fault. Sit with what that actually means. Every apartment building, every hospital, every overpass in Oakland, Berkeley, Hayward, and Fremont that was engineered to survive a certain level of ground shaking was engineered against numbers that we now know understate the real threat. When the buildings didn't get weaker, the threat got bigger, and nobody rebuilt around that fact yet, because the science only caught up to it this year. To understand what's actually at stake, look at the USGS's own Hayward earthquake scenario, a detailed multi-volume study modeling a hypothetical magnitude 7. Zero rupture on the Hayward fault with an epicenter in Oakland. And remember, this was built using the older, now known to be conservative ground motion models, before the 50% revision. Even under those numbers, the projections are staggering. Property damage and direct business disruption exceeding $82 billion. More than 5 million people directly affected. Violent shaking lasting over a minute across East Bay cities from Richmond to Fremont. The Association of Bay Area Governments places the full economic toll, once you count indirect impacts, at closer to $165 billion. And then there's the water problem, which keeps the emergency planners awake at night more than almost anything else. The Hetch Hetchy Aqueduct, the pipeline that delivers roughly 85% of San Francisco's drinking water, physically crosses the Hayward fault at Fremont. When the fault ruptures, that pipeline is expected to rupture with it. The Hayward scenario estimates water service could be cut to 4 million Bay Area residents, and based on how long water restoration took after comparable quakes, the 1994 Northridge earthquake in Los Angeles, magnitude 6. 7, smaller than what's projected here, left hundreds of thousands of people without water for weeks. Full restoration after a Hayward rupture wouldn't be measured in days, it would be measured in weeks, possibly longer. And water isn't just about drinking, it's about firefighting. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake actually killed more people through the fire that followed than through the shaking itself, because the water mains broke and firefighters had nothing to fight the flames with. That fire burned for 3 days. A modern earthquake creates the same ingredients. Broken gas lines, downed power lines, ignition sources everywhere at once, in a city with vastly more density and vastly more flammable infrastructure than 1906 ever had. This is what emergency managers call cascading failure. You can't restore power without transportation, you can't restore water without power for the pumping stations, you can't fully clear transportation until every bridge and overpass has been inspected, which takes personnel and equipment that are themselves tied up elsewhere in the disaster. The shaking isn't the disaster, the shaking is the trigger. The disaster is everything that happens in the weeks after, when a modern interconnected city has to claw its way back to function one broken system at a time. There's one more layer here that most coverage skips entirely. UC Berkeley researchers have found that the Hayward fault and the Calaveras fault, which runs parallel to it further east through the Tri-Valley area, appear to be physically connected at depth. If both faults ruptured together, which is seismically plausible, the result wouldn't be a magnitude 6, 7 or 7, 0 event. It could be closer to a 7, 3. And because the earthquake magnitude scale is logarithmic, a 7.3 releases roughly double the energy of a 7, 0. That's a scenario running directly beneath millions of people, through a water system that already crosses the fault, hitting buildings calibrated to shaking levels we now know were underestimated by half. That would be a generational event for the Bay Area on the scale of nothing California has experienced in the modern era. Now let's zoom out, because the Hayward fault is one piece of a much bigger, much more restless system. California sits directly on the boundary between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate. Two enormous slabs of the Earth's crust grinding past each other in what geologists call a transform boundary. The primary expression of that grinding is the San Andreas fault system, a network of faults over 1,000 kilometers long that isn't just one crack, but dozens of interconnected branches. The Hayward, the Calaveras, the Elsinore, the Garlock, and more. Every single one of them is loaded with stress that will eventually release. According to the 2026 Seismic Hazard Assessment, built on the USGS's Unified California Earthquake Rupture Forecast, roughly 16 million Californians and $3 trillion in building value sit inside extreme seismic hazard zones, areas where the expected peak ground acceleration during a design-level earthquake exceeds 50% of gravity. Los Angeles County's 10 million residents live within 50 kilometers of at least 3 separate faults, each capable of producing a magnitude 7, 0 or greater earthquake on their own. For that region, the 30-year probability of a major rupture on one of those nearby systems sits around 60%. Down south, the picture is its own kind of alarming. The southernmost stretch of the San Andreas Fault, near the Salton Sea northeast of San Diego, hasn't ruptured since somewhere around 1690 to 1700, based on paleoseismic trenching. That's over 300 years of accumulated strain on a fault segment whose natural repeat cycle runs somewhere between 150 and 200 years. USGS geophysicist Morgan Page has been direct about it. There is significant stress stored on the southern San Andreas. It's not on a countdown clock, but the accumulation of energy in that section of the crust is real and it's measurable. Earlier this year, in May 2026, an earthquake swarm rattled the ground around the Salton Sea again, in the complicated zone where the San Andreas and the Imperial fault systems connect. USGS geophysicist Andy Michael described that junction as a complicated zone with possible structures linking the two fault systems. And while any individual swarm has a relatively low chance of triggering a larger rupture, it's not zero, and every swarm is a reminder that this stretch of California is active and unpredictable. Further north, the San Andreas near Tejon Pass, the section that links southern and northern California, hasn't ruptured since the Fort Tejon earthquake of 1857, a magnitude 7.9 monster. The estimated recurrence interval on that segment is around 100 years. It's now been 169. Overdue again, loaded again, and it's worth being precise about what overdue actually means, because it gets misused constantly. Faults don't run on human calendars. They don't know that it's been 158 years on the Hayward or 300 years down at the Salton Sea. Recurrence intervals are statistical averages built from a handful of data points stretching back centuries, and any individual gap between earthquakes can run longer or shorter than that average. An overdue fault is not a fault about to rupture next Tuesday. It's a fault where the geological conditions, the accumulated strain, the stored energy in the rock, match what's historically preceded a major event. That's a meaningfully different claim than a prediction, and it's an important one to hold on to, so this information leads you toward preparation instead of panic. Here's the backdrop. This is all playing out against. California recorded roughly 500 earthquakes of magnitude 2, 5 or greater, in just the first part of 2026. In the past 30 days alone, more than 50 quakes at that threshold have rattled the state. The live seismic monitoring network, the one scientists watch continuously, shows a fault system that genuinely never stops moving. It's just a question of scale. Most of it is small. Most of it is invisible to daily life. But it's the same underlying machinery that, on a longer and far less predictable timescale, produces the events that reshape cities. And this is happening in a state that, for all its world-leading seismic science, is not actually ready for what its own scientists are describing. Only about 13% of California homeowners carry earthquake insurance. 13%. That means close to 9 out of 10 homeowners in the most seismically active developed economy on Earth have no financial protection if a major quake damages or destroys their home. Roughly 1 million buildings across California were constructed before modern seismic codes existed. Soft-story buildings, apartment complexes with weak, open-ground floors, garages, or commercial storefronts holding up multiple floors of housing above them, remain some of the most dangerous structures in an earthquake. And despite retrofit ordinances that have existed in cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco for years, compliance is still incomplete. Renters in particular often have no idea whether the building they sleep in every night has ever been retrofitted at all. There is real infrastructure working in your favor here, and it deserves credit. The Shake Alert early warning system is genuinely one of the most important pieces of public safety infrastructure the Western United States has built in the last decade. It can deliver warnings seconds to tens of seconds before strong shaking arrives at your location, triggering wireless alerts on cell phones, feeding into the MyShake app, and automatically slowing BART trains, pausing surgeries and shutting valves on gas lines and industrial equipment. In a major earthquake, those seconds are not a luxury. They're the difference between a surgeon stepping back from an open incision and not, a train braking before derailment risk climbs, a person getting under a table instead of standing next to a window when the shaking arrives. But Shake Alert cannot stop an earthquake. It cannot retrofit an unreinforced masonry building. It cannot move a water pipeline off a fault line. It gives you a warning. What happens in the seconds, days, and weeks after that warning depends entirely on what was or wasn't done in the years before it. So what do you actually do with all of this? Because the danger of a video like this is that it can feel like information without an exit. Numbers designed to alarm you and then nothing else. That's not the goal here. The goal is that you walk away from this video and actually do 3 or 4 concrete things this week. First, know your zone. California's Alquist-Priolo earthquake fault zone maps are public and free, and they show exactly which areas sit inside the highest hazard zones for fault rupture and strong shaking. If you live, work, or send your kids to school anywhere near the Hayward Fault, the San Andreas, or any of the state's other mapped active faults, that's information you should have, not information that finds you for the first time when the ground starts moving. Second, build the kit and actually keep it somewhere you can reach it in the dark. Water for at least 3 days per person in your household, any medication you or your family depend on. Copies of important documents, ID, insurance, medical records, either physical or backed up somewhere accessible without power. A battery-powered or hand-crank radio, a flashlight. Cash and small bills, because if the power's out, the ATMs and card readers are out too. The USGS and California's Office of Emergency Services both publish detailed free preparedness checklists, and they take about 15 minutes to work through. Third, if you live in an older building, whether you own it or rent it, find out whether it's been seismically retrofitted, and specifically whether it has the soft story vulnerability described earlier. Cities across California maintain public retrofit compliance records. This is a 5-minute search that tells you something genuinely important about the building you sleep in. Fourth, take the earthquake insurance question seriously. The California Earthquake Authority offers policies, and it isn't cheap, and for a long time that cost has been the reason most people skip it. But for most homeowners, their house is the single largest asset they own, and without earthquake coverage, a major quake that damages or destroys it doesn't just cost you a home, it can leave you paying a mortgage on a structure that no longer exists. That's a decision worth making with your eyes open, not one worth deferring indefinitely because it's uncomfortable to think about. The earthquake map of California hasn't changed in the sense that the faults have physically moved to new locations. They're exactly where they've always been. What's changed is the science underneath the map, and that's arguably more important. The LLNL and LBNL study, revising Hayward fault shaking estimates upward by as much as 50%, isn't a footnote. It's a fundamental recalculation of what the hazard actually is, arriving in the same year that the fault itself produced a swarm of earthquakes strong enough to be felt from Santa Rosa to Sacramento. Nobody is saying the Hayward fault is going to rupture next week. Nobody credible ever says that, because nobody can know that. What the science is saying, clearly and with more precision than it's ever had before, is that the fault is loaded, the historical window for a major event is open, the shaking models have just gotten significantly more serious, and the number of people and buildings sitting in the path of all of it keeps growing every year. Communities that prepare for major earthquakes consistently see lower casualty rates than communities that don't, even when the actual physical shaking they experience is identical. Japan has proven this over and over, through decades of building codes, public education, and infrastructure investment that treats earthquake readiness as a permanent ongoing responsibility rather than a box to check once. California has real strengths here. Some of the best seismic monitoring and early warning technology on the planet, a growing body of retrofit ordinances, and now a far more accurate picture of what the next major Hayward earthquake could actually look like. What it doesn't have yet is a population where earthquake preparedness matches the size of the risk, 13% insured, 1 million pre-code buildings still standing. Millions of people who felt Thursday's shaking said, "That was a big one," and went back to their morning without a second thought. That's the real pattern with small earthquakes on dangerous faults. They shake. They remind you for a moment that the ground beneath your feet is not as solid as it feels. And then they pass, and life resumes, and the reminder fades until the next one. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake killed an estimated 3,000 people in a city of 400,000. The Bay Area today holds more than 8 million residents, layered with infrastructure that is more complex, more interdependent, and more fragile in the specific ways that matter during a major quake than anything that existed in 1906. A comparable rupture on the Hayward Fault, running directly beneath the dense urban core rather than out along the coast, would unfold in a landscape nothing in California's history has actually tested. So here's where things stand, plainly, as of this week in August 2026. A swarm of earthquakes just rattled the Hayward Fault, the most dangerous urban fault in the country, 158 years past its last major rupture and sitting right inside its historical recurrence window. A landmark study published this year shows the next major Hayward earthquake could shake the ground up to 50% harder than the models our buildings and retrofit standards were built on. 16 million Californians live inside extreme seismic hazard zones. Only 13% of homeowners carry earthquake insurance. 1 million buildings across the state predate modern seismic codes. The southern San Andreas hasn't ruptured in over 300 years on a fault segment that typically resets every 150 to 200. And the state recorded roughly 500 earthquakes of magnitude 2. 5 or greater in just the first part of this year. The ground moving constantly, quietly, relentlessly beneath one of the most economically important regions on Earth. The map hasn't changed because the faults moved. It's changed because we finally understand them better than we did a year ago, and what we understand is more serious than what we were told before. So the question isn't really whether a major California earthquake is coming. Every geologist studying this fault system will tell you it is, eventually, the way winter always eventually comes. The real question, the one this video is actually about, is whether you and the people you care about will be ready when it does. If you found this useful, share it with someone in California who hasn't thought about this in a while. And if you've been putting off building a go bag, buying some stored water, or finding out whether your building has been retrofitted, today is a genuinely good day to stop putting it off. The fault moved again this week. The science just got more serious. And the clock, whatever it's actually counting down to, is still running.